good afternoon. I hope lunch was good. It's always a mixed blessing to speak immediately after lunch, but hopefully you're all ready for a little bit of innovative talk, which is what I intend to do today. So, as he said, I am currently Vice President of Product Management at LinkedIn, and my main focus at LinkedIn is on product strategy. Up until about a year ago, I was still working on a daily basis with an operational role at LinkedIn. But now I have an opportunity to actually see the business from the center, and I'm hoping to be able to share some of that insight today. So we're very honored that His Highness has actually begun turning to LinkedIn to share some of his thoughts about innovation and about government, and about the changing relationship between the government and the private sector on LinkedIn. So he wrote his very first post with us last year in October. And you can see it's called The Brain Regain. He was looking at some data that we had about the migration of talent in and out of Europe. And that information basically said that the UAE was actually the biggest single beneficiary of talent movement out of Europe, which is actually a big change because it wasn't so long ago that the UAE actually had movement in the opposite direction. So it's definitely worth looking into because he's got a lot of great insights about that information. But what I would like to do is turn to his most recent post as inspiration for what I'm going to talk about today. So just last week, he posted a post called Innovate or Stagnate, where basically he asked the question, what is it about some Fortune 500 companies which means they remain a component of the Fortune 500 for decade after decade, while other Fortune 500 companies sort of drop out and vanish? What is it which distinguishes those companies? And what he identified is what you see here, that the key to corporations and civilization and human development is, simply put, innovation. The ability to reinvent yourself and the ability to do new things is essential. So he was saying, how can we, government, learn from what the private sector has discovered about innovation as a mechanism for driving sustainable government, which is able to continue to return results to its people? And he had two main areas that he laid out, two challenges. So the first one was, in the face of all the economic change that we're likely to see coming up, how do we prepare our children for a future which looks like that? And the second one is, how do cities and governments compete for talent when basically talent is so scarce, and especially drawing innovators and inventors is so difficult? So I'm going to take those as inspiration and take, I hope, an innovative approach to solving both of those problems. But let's start first by talking about where we are. So right now, the largest and most extreme problem with unemployment in the world is among youth. There are about 337 million young people between the ages of 16 and 25 who are not in education, employment, or training, which basically means that they are neither in a career nor preparing for a career. And you can see that in some cases, like in South Asia, it represents a very large percentage of the population. Obviously, youth is always the most hard hit when it comes to hard economic times, but this particular direction is endemic to other major changes in the economy. You may have seen this graph before. It basically describes the relationship between productivity and real wages, especially in the manufacturing sector, over time. You can see that even though productivity has continued to rise 115% over the rate it was in 1970, real wages is basically unchanged that entire time. And there are two possible forces which are causing this change. The first is globalization. Basically, from the year 1970 to about 1990, globalization was the major downward pressure in terms of real wages for manufacturing. And the reason was, of course, that suddenly manufacturers had competition all around the world rather than having competition only at home. However, once you get past 1995, basically you begin to see the overall manufacturing population worldwide begin to shrink. That is not something which is caused by globalization. That's caused by the second force, which is making such a big difference for economies right now, and that's the arrival of automation and technology. Those changes are actually making a gigantic difference, and they're a big part of the story that we need to tell about what the future of work actually looks like. Yesterday, Erik Brynjolfsson, I don't know if anybody saw his presentation yesterday, but Erik and his co-author, Andy McAfee from MIT, wrote a book called The Second Machine Age, which basically neatly sums up what the technology change that we're actually seeing. It basically goes from a time when technology was mainly about augmenting our muscles to a time, the second machine age, when it's about augmenting our minds and our ability to get things done. And this is the transition we're actually going through. So going from a place where a human being had to be involved in every component of construction and manufacture to a place where a single human being, through technology, can basically have a higher productivity than a large number of other human beings. That change has basically rendered every job in the world to become a technology job. You have to be technologically capable in order to be able to do any of this work. So I'm a member of the board of directors of a group called the Hope Street Group. And the Hope Street Group is a nonprofit in the United States, and we focus on economic opportunity. And we, the Hope Street Group, got together with the Alcoa Foundation. People are familiar with Alcoa. It's a large manufacturing conglomerate in the US. And we looked at how this change in terms of technological enablement of manufacturing is affecting their workforce. And this is basically what we found out. In 2014, at the end of that year, there were 600,000 jobs in advanced manufacturing in the US, which were still open, unfilled, that basically couldn't be filled by Americans. The reason is that they couldn't find people who have the skill set necessary to be able to come in and take those jobs. And it's actually a very acute problem for them. The reason that's true is that in 2020, there'll be 3 million unfilled jobs in that area. The reason that's the case is that a lot of Alcoa's current employee base is actually beginning to retire, and they're leaving the company. And they're going to leave a huge gap behind them, which basically the systems that are in place today can't fill. This, of course, is only a part of the larger economic crisis around skills in the US. So today, we've got about 8 million unemployed Americans and about 4 million open jobs, where basically those Americans are not prepared to actually do that work. And our education system is actually not keeping pace. So education systems really aren't designed to keep pace. They're actually designed for a different purpose. But the rate of change is leaving them behind. McKinsey did a study where they asked educators and employers, how effective is education in terms of preparing people for the world of work? And the educators said, oh, we're doing great. 95% of people said, yeah, we're preparing people for their jobs. But when you asked employers, they said, actually, only 30% thought they were actually doing great. It's actually kind of like the educators are kind of living in a parallel universe where they don't really understand how to prepare people for the world of work. So, this becomes even more evident when you look at some data that comes out of the LinkedIn product. So this is a list of the top 20 skills that got people hired in 2014. And you can see when looking through that a lot of these things are brand new skills, which basically haven't existed for more than 3 or 4 years. So the educational system is actually not prepared to change as quickly as is required to continue to train people to take these roles. So that's the problem. So the question is, with all this change that technology is actually making, what do the jobs of the future actually look like? So they basically fall into 3 categories. So the first one is creators and innovators. Creators and innovators are the people who actually create not only new technologies, but new business. And these are, in fact, the people that everybody's fighting for to become part of their countries, of their companies, because these are the people who actually drive innovation. They're basically fit into 2 categories. One are inventors and scientists, people who are doing the basic research required in order to develop new technology and create new capabilities. So nanotech and biotech, advanced materials, all the things that scientists are doing today in terms of fundamental research comes from this group. This kind of job will remain safe for a long period of time, unaffected by the progress of technology. As a matter of fact, accelerated by technology. The other group are innovators, people who actually take those technological capabilities and turn them into businesses, which then impact the way that the economy actually functions. These people are the entrepreneurs, the people who create businesses in Silicon Valley. They're the people who create businesses worldwide which take advantage of technology. This class of job is entirely safe. The second is high-skill workers. So I said earlier that basically there's a collection of people who can't take high-skilled jobs. But those high-skilled jobs, once you're actually in them, it prepares you to do a lot of things and to have a powerful career going forward. But you need to be technologically capable to do it. There are basically two categories here. The first one is technology-enabled producers. These are people who moved from creating things with hand tools or with simple automation to a world where basically they're operating computer-driven machinery to be able to do the same thing. It also includes a whole new swath of people who are beginning to appear who loosely fall under the category of the maker movement. The maker movement, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a bunch of people who basically, now that technology is actually relatively accessible, they actually experiment with advanced manufacturing techniques, basically in their garages or in their homes. And even though they're a brand new thing, and that's a big deal for robotics and drones and so forth, it's going to be a big deal everywhere when 3D printing actually becomes cheap enough for everybody to have, and the maker movement has become a real force to reckon with. The second group that matters is what I call the versatiles. The versatiles are people who use a combination of technical skill and then human problem solving and mobility. So one thing computers and automation are really bad at is being adaptable. They can't react well to circumstances because they're not smart enough to actually do that. These are the guys who climb telephone poles, they're the people who build oil pipelines, they're the people who come install your cable. They're basically people who have to make lots of on-the-ground decisions, but they're basically being enabled by technology to do that. That's going to be something which will take a long time for machines to actually replace. So that's the second class, the high-skilled worker. The third class are human touch workers. These are people who are participating in services being delivered where the presence of a human being really matters. So the first one is entrepreneurs, people who are creating small businesses. This requires the activity of a single person. It can't be replicated by machines or algorithms. The second are organizational managers. These are people who organize the efforts of tens or hundreds or thousands of people. Again, something which is going to be extremely hard to automate, so these jobs should be safe. The third one are human services, and this covers a huge, wide area. This includes anything where the presence of a human being is important. A doctor, a nurse, an artist, an entertainer, a restaurateur. All of these groups are jobs which are safe for the future, specifically because the presence of a human being matters to make them successful. So the question is then, who loses out? And it's actually a large number of people who lose out. His Highness, when he wrote his post, referred to an Oxford study, which basically indicates that about 47% of all the existing jobs are at risk to be automated out of existence. And that sounds like a pretty reasonable estimate for the number of jobs that will be affected. I mean, it's a wide variety of things. It includes all this stuff. Basically anybody who's going to be affected by automation, either by a machine or by an algorithm. Machines are going to replace long-haul trucking and taxi drivers. I work in Mountain View, where I'm constantly surrounded by self-driving cars. But also loan officers, personal finance, and so forth. All of those things are primarily driven by algorithms, which can make better decisions than human beings. So all of these things are at risk. So let's now return and talk about how we actually solve some of these problems. So the first question, the one I want to take on, is the one on the left. How do we prepare our children for future generations for this kind of change? So I want to concentrate first on the high-skill worker. That's that center category. And I want to talk about what we can actually do here. A couple years ago, I was participating in a couple of panels, and these were right during the presidential election, so we were talking a lot about job creation. And so I was sitting and talking with some of my panelists, my fellow panelists, before I actually did the panel. And one of the guys was the president of a community college. And basically, he claimed that he had solved the skills gap problem locally in his area. So I was like, sure, tell me how you actually did that. And the way in which he did it is this. looked around. He realized the students who were graduating from his college didn't actually have good results. They would take classes, and they would end up without jobs on the way out. So what he did is he reached out to local employers, and he found a local employer basically who assembled advanced machinery. So this, in case, was lasers, laser assembly, like this guy. And he worked with that employer to develop a curriculum which built a pipeline of individuals who then this company would basically agree to hire. So any student who actually entered the front of that would take that class and would be guaranteed an interview when they exited the opposite side. And when they got there, they found that the placement rate was 90%. So basically, those people were all able to get jobs through a system which actually looked like that. And then as I've traveled, I've discovered there's actually a lot of examples of this out there, which I've discovered all around the world, people who found these local solutions. But the problem is that it actually needs really strong local leadership to succeed. It's very time-consuming to execute, and it's frankly not scalable. So the question for me is, could we actually borrow something from the world of the internet, the notion of an ecosystem, in order to help actually address this problem? So everybody knows what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a product which basically operates so that multiple people who are participating in the product are not only getting value out of it for their own requirements, but also they're contributing value back to the whole system. So the best example of this is probably Google, at least on the internet. Google is a great example of an ecosystem because there are people who search for results, who need to get quality results. There are people who are website owners who are trying to make their websites visible to the people who are actually doing the searching. And then there are people who are advertisers who are basically trying to help people make those decisions and choose their products and services. Those results only appear when they're better than the native results. So those three, each acting on their own accord and for their own purposes, basically have created the world's largest repository and source of information, which is an amazing outcome for all of us, regardless of what role we're actually playing in the system. So could we build a similar thing in the world of jobs? So I think the answer is yes. These three players, the three players that they mentioned, that this community college president mentioned, they all have their own reasons to participate in a system. So first, the job seeker is looking for those jobs. The job seeker is looking for somebody to apply for and for training that works. The employer is looking for that pipeline of qualified candidates. They're also looking for a set of education partners. And the educator is looking to bring students into their institution, and they're looking for employer partners who can drive results for those students down the line. So everyone's there for their own purposes. If we were able to make a system like this work, we can imagine something where an employer would basically be able to understand their local skills gap, where they'd be able to choose proven educators, people who actually drive results, and where they'd be able to build and hire from this new pipeline that they've actually created. While the educator would be able to see in their local area what skills actually needed training, be able to develop those pipelines with employers, and basically be able to drive outcomes for their students. And the job seeker, probably the most important person in this because they're the least served, would be able to compare their own skills to what the market was, but then find combinations of training and jobs which actually would allow them to move into these high-skill roles. This is not something that industry could do all by itself. It requires too much from too many sources to be successful. So for the job seeker, one of the key bits about making the job seeker successful in a system like this would be to make sure they get the tools in their hands. One of the real challenges about, especially reaching certain populations, is that there aren't systems which actually get technology tools in their hands. So if you're an unemployed person, or if basically you didn't have a high school guidance counselor, where are you going to get all of that information? Government can actually smooth that adoption by making it into something which is actually distributed through government's resources. And second, this military to civilian transition is actually really hard. In the US, there are millions of ex-military personnel who are trying to re-enter civilian life. But unfortunately, the skills that they learned back when they were in the military don't translate well to the world of the civilian world. Or at the very least, no one can understand how to take a military skill and apply it to a civilian skill. So this is one of the places where government can make that translation easily. A lot of employers are too small, like this laser manufacturer, to actually pay for their own training. So government can help actually foot the bill for effective training. And the most important area is the educator. The hardest thing about education is that a lot of government support for education that's existed in the past, and this is certainly true in the US, is about getting people into the school, but not about driving outcomes for those people. So ideally, if we could change that equation so that instead of paying people to enter school, change them pay for the results that they actually receive on the way out, we could completely change the game for this entire system. And also, we're going to need to enable education startups, and this is a place where government can play a role as well. There is no way that the existing educational structures that exist are going to be able to continue to train the constantly changing list of skills. It's just not possible. The only way we're going to be able to fill those gaps is to have new startups who are trying new mechanisms for training. So those are all ways in which government can support the development of a system which looks like this. Of course, all this needs to lie on top of a platform, and LinkedIn will play some role in the development of this, but in a lot of ways, we've tried to position ourselves to be a resource on which this kind of system could operate. Because over the years, we've been building something called the economic graph, which is basically the connection of people, companies, jobs, skills, and universities. So we have 347 million members, 4 million active companies, 3 million jobs, 3 billion skill endorsements, 25,000 skills. They're all part of this thing, which is the economic graph. And we hope that we can be part of the foundation for building a system like this down the line. One great example of the economic graph in action is already live, and you can go look at it now. It's called LinkedIn College Rankings, and it's the very first outcomes-based college ranking system in the world. If, for instance, I don't know if you can read this, but it's a little small. But basically, if you're an accounting professional, we say that Vanderbilt University is the right, Villanova University is the right place to go. And how do we know that? Because what we've done is we've looked at all the most desirable jobs in the world of accounting, and we've looked at the places, the schools which actually produce the graduates who are able to get those jobs. We're able to see this through the profile information that we have, and through the job information we've collected, and through the relationships we have with educational institutions. And we're able basically to give students a new data point which will allow them to make better decisions down the line in terms of where they actually want to go, if they in fact know what they want to do after they graduate. So that's a way to address the high skill worker. So I want to turn to how do we attract the innovator and make them part not only of a company but also part of a country. So what I'd like to do here is talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about innovators. And I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me not that long ago at LinkedIn, which was basically this. About 9 months ago, I noticed on my calendar had arrived an invitation to join an interview for an engineering candidate. And it was weird because it was a second round interview, and I almost never interview engineers before like the third round or the fourth round or whatever. So I went to the hiring manager and asked him what's going on. And the hiring manager said, actually, he asked for you, which I thought was weird. So I went and met the candidate. And this guy's name is Francis, and we've actually hired him as our new head of international engineering. And basically what he said to me was, so I've been a LinkedIn member since 2003, and I have loved from the beginning what you do as a company. But I was really afraid when you started to grow really fast in 2009 that basically it would kind of ruin your company, and that you basically would become, you would lose track of the thing you were trying to achieve in the world, and you'd be much more about the organization. And then you had your IPO, and your IPO was this big, like, well, now are they going to become all about the share price, and they're going to lose track of where they want to go? So the reason I want to talk to you, Alan, is I want to make sure that you guys are still interested in making a difference in the world, because that's the company I want to work for. I can choose any company in the world, and I'm going to choose the one which is going to bring meaning to me as a professional. This mindset is what my co-founder, Reid Hoffman, calls the founder mindset. These are people who are basically able to make any choice for any kind of employment they want. So they're going to pick something which aligns well with the purpose that they want to find in their own lives. So let's talk about what motivates these people and what we've learned about them, and also pretty much the entire following generation, because everything I'm going to say about innovators is probably true of what we call millennials. The first thing that motivates innovators is economic freedom. So if you're an innovator, the key piece is you don't want to think about money. You want to do the work. That doesn't mean you need to be rich, doesn't mean you need to make a ton of money. What it means is you don't want to think about money. It shouldn't be something you actually consider. So this is table stakes for hiring somebody who's in this class. The second thing is you want to work with great people. So great people, this is probably the thing I've heard most from this innovative group. Basically, they don't want to come into an environment where they don't respect the people around them. They want people around them to challenge them, to be able to provide great ideas. That's a big part of the value of being in that job. The third thing is they need autonomy. They don't want to be told what's right and wrong. They will discover for themselves what's right and wrong. And that's what attracts them to that role. And the fourth thing, and the one I mentioned before, is purpose. The folks in this group need a purpose. They will do work which is aligned with the work that they, with the way in which they see meaning for their own lives. So I'm going to call upon an inspiration from the X Prize. And I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with the X Prize, so I'll give you a quick rundown on what it actually is. I know Peter Diamandis was here, I think last year, so I'm not sure if he talked about the X Prize or not. It's basically this. It's a way of driving innovation, basically by challenging innovators to create new things. So they pick a really interesting, hard problem which requires innovative solutions, and they put it out there, well stated, well defined, and then they put a price tag on it. They say, if you solve this problem, we're going to pay you $3 million or something. A good example of this might be the Wendy Schmidt, this is a long and difficult title, the Wendy Schmidt Oil Cleanup X Challenge, which was one of the ones they've successfully run. It was actually a fascinating thing. They basically said, hey, we're going to challenge anybody in the world to double the effectiveness of oil cleanup technology off the top of the surface of the water. And anybody who's able to do that gets $1.4 million. So they had dozens of teams actually compete to drive for that result. They had one winner who actually increased the efficacy of it by 4 times, which is an amazing thing. And the top 3 teams were all able to sell their technology into the marketplace, the stuff they had developed when they were actually pursuing the prize. So it was one of those great like win-win kind of situations. And they've done all kinds of things. They've done basically being able to reusable spacecraft and a whole string of other things. It's definitely worth looking up if you haven't actually heard about the X Prize. The reason I'm mentioning it is not because I think X Prize is necessarily the right way to go, although it's interesting because India is actually experimenting right now with whether X Prize is a way of driving innovation within India, which I think is fascinating. But because it relates to purpose. So if you're looking for a way that you can motivate those innovators, and one of the things which motivates them most is having a purpose, something they can actually reach out for, then a grand challenge might actually be a way to do that. So if we can combine the idea of a grand challenge with the idea of building up an innovation hub, we might actually get something which could accelerate results for driving innovation locally. So here's basically the idea. We're first going to focus on what enables innovation to occur. Second, we're going to talk about what could ignite that, what grand challenges we could actually use to ignite it. And third, how do you nurture it once it's actually in place? So let's talk first about enablement. This is actually something which will be very familiar to many people in the room. I'm deeply impressed by the work that His Highness's government is doing in terms of driving innovation here in Dubai and in the UAE. It's not only is it very forward-thinking, but I think that of all the efforts I've seen, I think it seems to be the one which is best aligned for success. So incredibly impressive. So you all know, those of you who have been involved in that effort, know what it is to build enablement for innovation. The 2 at the top are obvious, capital and infrastructure. Capital is important because innovation will cost money and you need to be able to pay for it. Infrastructure is important because you're always building on top of something and you need it in place. So certainly coming from Silicon Valley, we would be nowhere if it hadn't been for telecom companies and for the DARPA net and so forth. These other 2 are potentially slightly different. So the first one is access to success. I think one of the things which I found most remarkable about innovation is it can basically come from anywhere. So one of the things which I think is important in terms of setting the table properly for generating innovation is making sure that anybody can participate in the development of that innovation. So I was deeply impressed. I went to Jordan in October and was able to meet King Abdullah. It was amazing. And I was actually able to go there and visit some of the incubators they've set up at the ICT Center in Amman. And they've done a great job sort of leveling the playing field and inviting many people to come in and participate in the process of innovation. And that's really, to me, the standard for making sure that the entry points for innovation are clear and open to anybody. The second one is about openness. There's a great story about this, which Peter writes about in his book, Peter Diamandis writes about in his book, Abundance. So it has to do with a grand challenge. It's not X Prize related. But basically, there was a mining company in Canada. And this mining company, they had just basically purchased all this land. And they had done all their geographic surveys and so forth, geological analysis. But they didn't have the personnel internally to be able to figure out where the gold was. So instead of guessing and digging in a lot of different places, they open sourced all that information. They basically made all that geographical study available to anybody who wanted to try to find the gold, which is a slightly crazy thing to do because that's the crown jewels. I mean, all that information was not only expensive to create, but theoretically is your primary competitive advantage. But they opened it and they offered a prize. They said, basically, anybody who can help us find the gold will pay you $500,000, the best solution for finding gold. So again, they had dozens of people actually participate. They paid $500,000 to somebody to actually, who actually had the best solution, and they made $2 billion in extracting gold from that location. So it's a great example of the value of openness, of making the data that people need in order to be able to execute on a challenge available. So that's enablement. I think, though, when we turn to the question of ignition, choosing an authentic challenge is absolutely the most important thing. So if you're going to challenge a group of people, the main things you want to do, because we're not just talking about solving a problem here, we're talking about solving a problem and bringing innovation to the place that you want it to be. So you need to find something which not only is authentically valuable for you, for your country, for your people to solve, but it's also got to be something which attracts innovative talent locally to come solve that problem. So I wrote down a bunch here which have nothing to do with you. They're all actually US-inspired possible things that people could do. Certainly, figuring out how to make the Keystone XL safe would be great, because I think we need to do that before we would actually invest in it. But all of these things are things that need to happen in the United States. But they could all bring people to the United States to solve these problems. So if you're able to pick something which not only is going to bring purpose to people who participate, but is also going to invite them to come join you, then actually you can then leverage that innovation to build an innovation center wherever you want to build it. So let's talk about igniting. So the first one is the grand challenge, and the most important thing is that authentic challenge. The second thing is, can you enable people to come local? Dubai and the UAE are way ahead on this anyway. I mean, I don't think anybody has thought as proactively about how basically to build an international city where anybody can come and participate than the UAE has. So amazing. That's something, however, that a lot of other governments, if they were attempting to make this happen, they would have to think a lot about. Because certainly bringing innovators to the United States is nowhere as easy as it should be if you were actually going to succeed. The third is this freedom to act. We talked a little bit earlier about making sure that you had that people had freedom to fail, freedom to do their own thing. Well, it's important to have this here. One of the questions I was asked when I was preparing this was about, is there something unique about government that dissuades innovators for joining it? And I think one of the things that dissuades innovators is this perception that they won't be entirely free to act. Or that they will reach so many roadblocks that basically they won't be able to achieve the thing they actually want to achieve. So I actually have seen 3 friends in the United States in the last 2 years go from the public sector into the private sector, into the Obama administration. And that change was actually very difficult for all 3 of them, because all 3 of them had this same concern. They're like, well, if I enter the government, am I just going to waste the next 4 years of my life trying to make something happen? Now, again, here in the UAE, I think the approach you've taken to sort of public-private partnership is so strong that I wouldn't worry about it here. But in a lot of environments, people are going to be very skeptical of coming in and working with government. So it's a problem that needs to be solved to be able to ignite innovation. And finally, supporting their efforts. So one thing about the X Prize, and one of the reasons we're not really talking about using the X Prize here, is the X Prize actually doesn't support any of the people who participate in it. So that Oil Cleanup X Challenge, the X Prize Commission didn't actually support any of that stuff. Basically, they all paid for it on their own. That was actually one of the great values of a grand challenge. But we're not really talking here about an X Prize style challenge. We're talking about a John F. Kennedy send a man to the moon and return him safely to the earth kind of challenge, which is to say, establish the challenge and then help people actually pay for the kind of innovation they want to do. So that's ignition. If they're actually able to bring that innovation, then the real question is about nurturing it. So our goal here is how do we take active innovators who are working on these challenges and use them as a seed for innovation within a country. So 4 ideas which I think are really important. The first is give those people easy access to ideas. Make sure that they are actually able to integrate the ideas they hear from smart people all around them. This is one of the reasons that universities are as powerful as sources of innovation as they are, because there are a lot of smart people there who are contributing ideas. Innovation is almost entirely driven by recombination of ideas. It's not lone geniuses operating, it's people interacting with other folks. So if you're going to house these people someplace, house them near a university to make sure they're surrounded by smart people all the time. Second is help them build markets. Help them find those markets. As I said, that oil challenge thing was important because not everybody won, but 3 of the teams were actually able to sell what they had developed, which means they won in the end, even though they didn't take the 1.4 million home. Third is make them into local heroes. You want to be able to use them as poster children, so to speak, for bringing more innovation to the system. So if they're creating something great for you, make sure everybody knows about it. And the final thing is make it contagious. Make sure that every young innovator you have has access to these people. So that as a country, if you see innovation occurring, make sure they're participating and spending time with the people who are actually executing on these challenges. Okay, so this is the summary of what it is. Will this work? Not guaranteed. However, I think that there's enough value here in terms of aligning effectively with the motivations that the innovators you're trying to attract have, that I think it's actually something which is worth investigating. So, first of all, thank you to His Highness for his inspiration in terms of creating this talk. It's been great to think about both of the challenges that he proposed. And with that, I will take your questions.